Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
Manifest destiny. Say the words aloud. Notice how they feel in your mouth. Notice, more importantly, what they suggest. Destiny. Something fated, inevitable, beyond human choice. Manifest. Obvious. Clear. Self-evident. Put them together and you have a phrase that forecloses debate before it even begins. If American expansion across the continent was destined, what is there to discuss? If destiny is manifest, who are we to question it? The phrase was coined in 1845 by a magazine editor named John L. O'Sullivan. He wrote that it was America's manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. Note the construction. Note what it assumes. Providence allots. This is God's plan, not human ambition. America does not choose to expand. America fulfills a destiny. The passive voice does important work here. It removes agency. It removes responsibility. It removes the need to justify specific acts of conquest because conquest is not what's happening. Prophecy is being fulfilled. The phrase was propaganda from its first utterance. And like all effective propaganda, it shaped how Americans understood their own history. It made expansion seem natural, inevitable, even benevolent. It obscured the choices that were made, the voices that dissented, the peoples who were dispossessed. Today, we examine what manifest destiny actually meant in practice. We will find peaceful purchases and wars of conquest. We will find principled opposition and its suppression. We will find a template for Imperial War, manufactured crisis, effective manipulation, congressional acquiescence. That would be used again and again and again from 1846 to 2003 and all the way to present day. We will also find, uncomfortably, that the practices developed during continental expansion, the habits of thought, the rationalizations, the techniques of subjugation, prepared the ground for overseas empire. The seeds were planted at home before they flowered abroad. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions podcast. This is episode 2 of the series, Empire of Liberty, America's foreign entanglements from the founders to the forever wars. Today, manifest destiny, continental expansion, and the seeds of empire. This episode corresponds to Article 2 of our written series. It was published last Sunday on our Substack page, and as always, the podcast expands on the themes from the article and provides some additional primary sources, addresses additional complexities that the written format cannot fully elaborate upon. Now, a note before we begin. This episode, it covers some very difficult history. The dispossession of Native American peoples, the Mexican-American War, the patterns of conquest that preceded overseas empire. I will present this history honestly, acknowledging where American conduct violated the very principles Americans claim to uphold. A libertarian analysis that sanitizes history is no analysis at all. At the same time, this is not a woebegone accounting of failures of America either. The American experiment demands reflection on our core values and examinations of where leaders from past generations, human beings also, faltered. We need to learn from past experiences and hold our next leaders, representatives, press, journalists, and citizens in general accountable. Let us not, out of some form of apathetic ignorance, repeat the same mistakes where those before us have faltered. Thus, with that said, let us begin. Before we examine what went wrong, let us establish what went right. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson doubled the size of the United States without firing a single shot. The Louisiana Purchase remains the most consequential real estate transaction in history. For approximately $15 million, roughly 4 cents per acre, the United States acquired 828,000 square miles of territory stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. The acquisition was made possible by Napoleon's strategic calculation that he could no longer defend Louisiana against British naval power, and by Jefferson's willingness to seize on an unexpected opportunity. But admittedly, Jefferson was troubled. As a strict constructionist, he believed the Constitution did not explicitly authorize the federal government to acquire foreign territory. He drafted a constitutional amendment to provide this authorization, and then he learned that Napoleon might withdraw the offer. Jefferson, the strict constructionalist, chose pragmatism over principle. The constitutional question matters for our purposes. Jefferson's decision established a precedent. Executive action in foreign affairs could expand beyond strict constitutional warrant when the opportunity presented itself. The Republic would not be destroyed by the Louisiana Purchase. Instead, it was enormously strengthened. But the precedent of constitutional flexibility in territorial matters would later be invoked for less benign purposes. What the Louisiana Purchase was not is also equally as important. It was not conquest. The territory was purchased from a European power with nominal claim, not seized from inhabitants by force. It was not colonialization in the European imperial sense. The acquired territory would be organized into states equal to the size of the original 13, not held as a permanent dependency. It was not, in the language of the founders, foreign entanglement. The transaction created no alliance, no ongoing obligation, no commitment to defend French interests. The Louisiana model, peaceful acquisition through purchase, with territory organized into equal states, would be repeated. Florida in 1819, the Gadsden Purchase in 1853, Alaska in 1867. The model was consistent with Republican principles. The problem was that peaceful acquisition was not the only model available. Another model existed, one involving war, conquest, and dispossession. And that model would increasingly dominate. Any honest account of continental expansion must confront an uncomfortable truth. The American West was not empty. Expansion required dispossession, and dispossession was accomplished through sustained violence for over a century. But before examining that violence, we must dispel a simplification that just distorts understanding There was no monolithic Indian nation. The indigenous people of North America comprised hundreds of distinct nations, each with its own language, its own culture, its own political structure, its own territory, its own interests. To speak of the Indians as a single entity is like speaking of the Europeans as if France, Russia, and Spain were interchangeable. Consider the diversity. The Iroquois Confederation of the Northeast, they operated a sophisticated constitutional system, the Great Law of Peace. Some scholars even argue that it influenced the American founders themselves. 6 nations bound by complex diplomatic arrangements, balancing power amongst themselves and against European interlopers. The Cherokee of the Southeast had, by the 1820s, adopted written language, Sequoia's syllabary, published newspapers, ratified a written constitution modeled on the American document, practiced plantation agriculture, and in some cases, owned African American slaves. By every standard Americans themselves had set for civilization, the Cherokee had met it. The Comanche dominated the southern plains as what historian Pekka Hamalian calls an empire, a mounted warrior society that controlled trade routes, raided deep into Mexico, and successfully resisted Spanish, Mexican, and American encroachment for generations. They were not victims awaiting conquest. They were a power to be reckoned with. The Navajo were pastoralists. The Pueblo people settled agriculturalists living in ancient cities. The Pacific Northwest tribes built elaborate societies around salmon fishing. The Great Basin peoples adapted to harsh desert conditions through sophisticated mobile foraging. These nations had their own histories, their own conflicts, their own ambitions, long before any Europeans set foot on the continent. Tribes warred against each other, formed alliances, competed for territory and resources. The arrival of the Europeans added new players into existing dynamics. It did not create conflict where none existed. So understanding this complexity is essential because American policy towards Native people was never uniform. It varied by tribe, by region, by era, and by circumstance. And it varied because Native peoples were not passive objects of policy, but active agents pursuing their own interests. During the colonial period and the Revolution, Native nations were sovereign powers whose alliances mattered and mattered greatly. The Iroquois Confederacy balanced between British and French interests for decades, extracting concessions from both of them. When the Revolution came, the Confederacy split. The Oneida, Tuscarora, they sided with the Americans. The Mohawk, Seneca, Onondaga, Cayuga largely supported Britain. This was not irrational. The British had attempted to limit colonial expansion westward with the Proclamation of 1763. American settlers pushed relentlessly onto native lands regardless of British law. From the native perspective, the British were the lesser threat. Many calculated, correctly as it turned out, that American victory would bring American settlers in overwhelming numbers. The Revolution's aftermath was catastrophic for Native peoples, regardless of which side they had chosen during the fight. American victory brought American settlers, and the new federal government lacked either the will or the capacity to restrain them. Treaties were signed and broken. The pattern was established early. The United States would negotiate as with sovereign nations, then disregard those negotiations when convenient. In the early republic, federal policy oscillated. One approach associated with Henry Knox, Washington's Secretary of War, and then later Thomas Jefferson, advocated what they called civilization. The idea was that Native peoples could be assimilated into American society if they adopted European agricultural practices, Christianity, and political organization. policy was paternalistic and it was ultimately coercive, but at least it acknowledged that Native peoples, they were potentially equal participants in American life in their view. The 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, pursued this path with remarkable success. The Cherokee in particular became a test case. They developed written language, they published newspapers, they adopted a constitution. They built schools and churches. By every metric Americans claim to value, the Cherokee had civilized. It made no difference. Andrew Jackson's presidency marked a decisive turn. Jackson has made his military reputation fighting the Creek and Seminole. He harbored no sympathy for accommodation. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 authorized the forced relocation of southeastern tribes to the territory west of the Mississippi, land then considered worthless, beyond the pale of American settlement. The justification was explicitly racial. Jackson argued that Native peoples were incapable of civilization, that their presence impeded American progress, and that removal was actually benevolent. It would protect them from extinction by separating them from white settlers. The argument was self-serving nonsense. The Cherokee had demonstrably civilized by every metric Jackson claimed to value. Removal would prove anything but protective. The Cherokee Nation challenged the policy in federal court. In Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, 1831, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that the tribes were domestic dependent nations. This was a novel category that acknowledged their sovereignty while still subordinating it to federal authority. In Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, Marshall went further, though. Georgia had attempted to extend state law over Cherokee territory. Marshall ruled this unconstitutional. Federal treaty obligations must be respected. The Cherokee were a nation, and Georgia had no authority over them. It was a ringing affirmation of tribal sovereignty. It was a declaration that the rule of law applied even when the powerful wished otherwise. Andrew Jackson's response has become legendary. He reportedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Whether or not Jackson spoke those exact words, his administration proceeded with removal. The Cherokee, along with the Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw, were forced westward in what became known as the Trail of Tears. They marched through winter. They died of exposure, disease, starvation, and despair. Estimates of deaths during the Cherokee removal alone range from 4,000 to 8,000, roughly 1/4 of the relocated population. The Seminole resisted. The Second Seminole War from 1835 to 1842 became the longest and most expensive Indian war in American history. Thousands of lives lost, tens of millions of dollars spent. Many Seminole were eventually removed, but a remnant remained in the Florida Everglades, never conquered, never surrendered. Their descendants remain there today. West of the Mississippi, a different dynamic prevailed. The Plains tribes, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Comanche, the Kiowa, were mobile, mounted warriors. Their military capabilities posed genuine threats to American expansion. The Comanche, in particular, controlled the southern plains for generations. They were not conquered by Spain. They were not conquered by Mexico. They would not be easily conquered by the United States. American policy toward Plains tribes combined treaty making, military campaigns, and most devastatingly, deliberate destruction of the buffalo herds that sustained Plains life. The strategy was explicit: destroy the buffalo, and the Indian problem would solve itself. General Philip Sheridan allegedly remarked that buffalo hunters had done more to settle the vexed Indian question than the entire regular army has done in the last 40 years. The buffalo population collapsed from tens of millions to near extinction by the 1880s. The Plains tribes, their economic base destroyed, had no choice but submission. The wars were brutal on both sides. The Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, Colorado militia slaughtered a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment. Women, children, elders, bodies mutilated. American flags and white flags of truce ignored. The Fetterman Fight, 1886, Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors annihilated an American cavalry detachment of 81 men. Not one survived. Little Bighorn, 1876. The most famous Indian victory. Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and a coalition of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors destroyed George Armstrong Custer's command. It guaranteed savage American retaliation. And Wounded Knee, 1890. American troops massacred several hundred Lakota, including many women and children. It marked the symbolic end of armed resistance. American policy was never monolithic. At various times, the federal government pursued civilization, removal, reservation confinement, assimilation, including forced boarding schools designed, in the chilling phrase of their founder, to kill the Indian, save the man. And allotment, which broke up communal tribal lands into individual parcels that could then be sold to white settlers. Each policy was presented as reform. Each resulted in further dispossession. Some tribes allied with the United States against traditional native enemies. They found their loyalty unrewarded. The Crow and Pawnee scouted for American against the Sioux. They ended up on reservations nonetheless. The Cherokee had fought alongside Andrew Jackson against the Creek. Jackson repaid them with removal. Alliances with the United States proved worthless. The outcome was the same regardless of tribal policy. A libertarian analysis cannot sanitize this history. The dispossession of Native Americans violated the natural rights principles that libertarianism claims to uphold. If individuals have the right to life, liberty, and property, and libertarian philosophy insists they do, then those rights apply to the indigenous peoples who inhabited this continent, regardless of their cultural practices, regardless of their political organization, regardless of whether they fit European definitions of civilization. The treaties were made and broken. The lands were seized. The populations were forcibly relocated. These were violations of natural rights by any consistent standard. The complexity of tribal politics does not excuse American conduct. That the Sioux and Crow were traditional enemies does not justify dispossessing both. That some tribes practiced slavery or warfare does not justify the destruction of all. The logic that holds individuals responsible for their individual acts, not their ethnic group, not their ancestors, not their neighbors, applies equally to Native peoples. American policy treated Indians as a collective problem to be solved, not as individuals and nations with rights to be respected. The relevance for our series is this. If America practiced conquest and subjugation domestically, the turn to overseas empire was not a complete departure. It was an extension of existing practices to new territories and new peoples. The habits of imperial thinking that some peoples were not capable of self-government, that their lands were better utilized by civilization, The treaties with them could be broken when convenient and formed at home before they were applied abroad. When American troops fought Filipino independence fighters in 1899, they employed tactics developed against the Sioux and Apache. When American administrators established colonial governments in Puerto Rico and the Philippines, they drew on experience managing Indian reservations. When American generals spoke of Filipino insurgents as savages requiring firm handling, they echoed decades of rhetoric about native peoples. The personnel even overlapped. Officers who fought in the Indian Wars led the Philippine campaigns. The ideology was continuous. This is domestic empire. Conquest and subjugation within claimed territorial boundaries, conducted over generations, rationalized by theories of racial superiority and civilizational progress. The founders spoke eloquently about liberty, and those were valuable lessons, in my opinion, for all humanity. For some of those of that generation, though, the liberty-oriented vision did not extend to the continent's original inhabitants. This failure illustrates the human fallibility within the American project. Just as there are flaws with all historical actions taken around the globe, but moreover, in this context, it established patterns that would shape American precedent and conduct when the Republic turned its attention overseas. If the Louisiana Purchase represented expansion consistent with Republican principles, the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 represented something different entirely. A war of conquest, provoked by executive manipulation, opposed by principal voices, justified by claims that would echo across American history for the next 175 years. James K. Polk won the 1844 presidential election on an openly expansionist platform. He wanted California. He wanted New Mexico. He wanted to resolve the disputed territory between the Ulysses River and the Rio Grande in America's favor. Mexico refused to sell. Polk determined to take by force what could not be obtained by negotiation. The constitutional problem was that only Congress can declare war. Polk needed a casus belli, an incident that would justify military action. He manufactured one. Sound familiar? It ought to. Manufacturing justifications for war is a long-standing practice by leaders that continues to foment global conflict to this day. In January 1846, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to march American troops into the disputed territory between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. This was land that Mexico considered its own. Polk knew Mexican forces were in the area. He knew a confrontation was likely, and that was the point. When Mexican forces attacked Taylor's detachment in April, Polk had his incident. On May 11th, 1846, he sent a war message to Congress. Listen to his words. Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon the American soil. This was, at best, a distortion. The territory where blood was shed was disputed. Mexico had a colorable claim to it. Polk had deliberately placed American troops in harm's way. In territory Mexico considered its own, precisely to provoke the incident he then used to justify war. Not all Americans accepted the narrative. The Whig Party opposed the war as executive usurpation and territorial conquest. Their opposition was not pacifist. Many Whigs supported military action once war was declared, but they refused to accept Polk's framing. The war, they argued, was an aggressive conflict designed to seize territory and extend slavery, initiated through presidential manipulation of the facts. The opposition included some of the most distinguished names in American politics. Daniel Webster denounced the war's origins. Henry Clay opposed it. John Quincy Adams, the aging former president still serving in the House of Representatives, voted against the war appropriations and called Polk's claims the most deplorable deception. But no one articulated the critique more sharply than a first-term congressman from Illinois. On December 22nd, 1847, Abraham Lincoln introduced his famous spot resolutions. He demanded that President Polk answer a simple question. Identify the particular spot of soil on which the blood of American citizen was shed. Whether that spot is or is not within the territory of Spain, at least after the Treaty of 1819, until the Mexican Revolution. Whether that spot is or is not within the territory which was wrested from Spain by the revolutionary government of Mexico. Whether that spot is or is not within a settlement of people who had never submitted themselves to the government or laws of Texas or of the United States. Lincoln's point was devastating. If the soil was genuinely American, Polk should be able to identify it. If he could not, his entire justification of war collapsed. Lincoln continued his attack in a speech on January 12, 1848. Let me quote at length because these words have echoed across American history. I more than suspect already that he is deeply conscious of being in the wrong, that he feels the blood of this war, like the blood of Abel, is crying to heaven against him. That originally having some strong motive to involve the two countries in a war and trusting to escape scrutiny by fixing the public gaze upon the exceeding brightness of military glory, that attractive rainbow that rises in showers of blood, that serpent's eye that charms to destroy, he plunged into it and has swept on and on till, disappointed in his calculations of the ease with which Mexico might be subdued, he now finds himself, he knows not where. The critique cost Lincoln politically. He was labeled unpatriotic. His opponents called him Spotty Lincoln. He did not seek re-election. But his analysis proved prescient. The Mexican-American War was exactly what he said. An aggressive war manufactured by a president who deceived Congress about the circumstances and swept the nation into conflict before deliberation could occur. And the consequences? The United States won the military contest decisively. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in February 1848, transferred to the United States approximately 525,000 square miles of territory. Present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. The acquisition transformed America into a continental power, stretching from Atlantic to Pacific. But consequences followed. The Wilmot Proviso debate, whether slavery would be permitted in the conquered territory, accelerated the sectional crisis that would produce civil war just 13 years later. Ulysses Grant served as a young officer in the Mexican War. He later offered judgment in his memoirs. I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico. I thought so at the time when I was a youngster. Only I had not moral courage enough to resign. He called it one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. Grant was not a radical. He was not an anti-war activist. He was the commanding general who won the Civil War, the 18th president of the United States, and he looked back on the Mexican War as wicked and unjust. The Mexican-American War established a template that would recur throughout American history. Executive manipulation. A president determined on a war creates circumstances designed to produce an incident. Then he presents Congress with a fait accompli. Manufactured casus belli. The triggering incident is presented as foreign aggression against America, when it was actually American provocation on disputed or foreign territory. Congressional acquiescence. Congress votes for the war after the fact, unwilling to deny support to troops already in the field. And critics marginalized. Those who question the war's legitimacy are labeled unpatriotic, disloyal, cowardly. Their arguments are not answered. They are shouted down. And that leaves unforeseen consequences. The war's architects do not anticipate how territorial conquest will destabilize domestic policies. The template would be applied again and again. The Maine in 1898. Remember the Maine, launching the Spanish-American War. Lusitania in 1915, contributing to American entry in World War I. The Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, an incident that may not have occurred as reported, launching full-scale American involvement in Vietnam. WMDs in 2003. Purported imminent humanitarian catastrophe in Libya in 2011, leading to the execution of Gaddafi, a failed state that has open slave markets today in 2026. Purported chemical weapons in Syria, leading to arming ISIS with U.S. arms. And, well, I could go even into more recent events, but I will save those for our contemporary application podcast. The point is, each time the pattern repeats: a triggering incident, presidential framing, congressional acquiescence, critics silenced, and then the consequences are unexamined until too late. After the Civil War, imperial temptation arose and was resisted. President Ulysses Grant sought to annex Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic, in 1870. His motives were mixed: strategic interest in Caribbean bases, concern for freed people who might immigrate, perhaps personal financial interests of his associates. Grant submitted an annexation treaty to the Senate. The treaty failed. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts led the opposition, arguing that annexation violated the rights of the Dominican people to self-determination. The Senate rejected the treaty 28-28, falling short of the required two-thirds majority. Self-determination. It's an interesting concept to think of other countries having that right. And this episode is significant because it shows the Republic still possessed institutional antibodies against territorial expansion beyond the continent. Grant was a popular president and a war hero. He pushed hard for annexation, and he lost. The distinction between continental consolidation and overseas empire still commanded respect. But as the 19th century drew to a close, one man would make the last presidential stand for the founders' foreign policy. His name was Grover Cleveland. Cleveland was not a radical. He was a conservative Democrat, a proponent of sound money, limited government, and strict constitutional construction. He vetoed more bills than all previous presidents combined. He resisted protective tariffs. He opposed federal intervention in the economy beyond constitutional warrant. And his foreign policy was congruent with his domestic philosophy. The United States should not project power where it had no legitimate interest. It should not acquire territory through force or fraud, and should not interfere in other nations' internal affairs. Cleveland's test came over Hawaii. American sugar planters and missionaries had established a significant presence in Hawaii by the late 1890s. They chafed under the rule of Queen Liliuokalani, who sought to strengthen Native Hawaiian governance at the expense of American influence. In January 1893, with active agreement of American Minister to Hawaii John L. Stevens, in support of U.S. Marines landed from the USS Boston, American residents overthrew the Queen. They established a provisional government and sought annexation to the United States. The outgoing Harrison administration negotiated an annexation treaty and submitted it to the Senate. Then, Grover Cleveland took office. Cleveland withdrew the treaty. He ordered an investigation. His commissioner, James Blunt, reported back, "The revolution had been accomplished by American force. Most native Hawaiians opposed annexation. The overthrow would not have succeeded without the Marines' presence. Minister Stevens had actively conspired with the revolutionaries and had recognized the provisional government before the Queen had even formally surrendered." The United States government had used military force to overthrow a sovereign government without authorization, without justification, without any legitimate American interest at stake. Cleveland's conclusion was unambiguous. He refused to complete the annexation treaty of the territory seized by fraud and force. In his message to Congress, Cleveland laid out his reasoning. Listen to these words. They could have been written by Washington or Jefferson. "I mistake the American people if they favor the odious doctrine that there is no such thing as international morality, that there is one law for a strong nation and another for a weak one, and that even by indirection of strong power may with impunity despoil a weak one of its territory." Cleveland considered attempting to restore the Queen. The proposal proved impractical. The provisional government was entrenched and armed. Unable to undo the wrong, Cleveland refused to ratify it. Hawaii remained in limbo, governed by the Republic of Hawaii proclaimed by American settlers, unannexed by the United States. Cleveland was applying the founders' foreign policy to a concrete case. America should not acquire territory through conquest or subterfuge. His principles commanded enough support that annexation remained blocked throughout his term. He was the last president to hold that line. Hawaii would be annexed in 1898 under President McKinley. This was during the war fever of the Spanish-American conflict. Cleveland lived until 1908, long enough to see America become an imperial power with colonies spanning the Pacific. Long enough to see American troops fighting Filipino independence fighters in a brutal counterinsurgency. And long enough to see everything the founders warned against come to pass. He opposed it till the end. As of 1897, America stood at a fork in the road. The Republic could consolidate its continental gains and remain what it had been, a regional power commercially engaged with the world, politically detached from it, following upon the counsel of Washington and Jefferson. The founders' principles remained viable. Cleveland had demonstrated they could still be applied. The institutional antibodies still functioned. And the anti-imperialist tradition still commanded respect. Where America could choose differently. By the 1890s, forces were converging that would overwhelm the tradition Cleveland represented. Social Darwinism applied survival of the fittest to nations. Anglo-Saxonism and racial theories provided pseudo-scientific justification for expansion. Alfred Thayer Mahan's influence of sea power upon history argued that national greatness required naval power, and naval power required overseas bases. The United States began building a modern steel navy. Strategic logic demanded Pacific and Caribbean possessions. The 1890 census announced the closing of the frontier. The frontier had been central to American identity. Its disappearance created anxiety and a search for new frontiers overseas. The yellow press of Hearst and Pulitzer discovered that war sold newspapers. Cuban atrocities, real and exaggerated, made spectacular copy. By 1897, the drumbeat for intervention had reached fever pitch. The transformation required a catalyzing event, an incident that would sweep away restraint in a tide of patriotic fervor. The event was coming. On February 15, 1898, in Havana Harbor, the USS Maine would explode. Continental expansion contained elements that honored the founders' principles and elements that violated them. The Louisiana Purchase showed that expansion could occur peacefully through negotiation, with territory organized into equal states rather than held as colonies. The Indian Wars showed that America could practice conquest and subjugation at home, establishing habits of imperial thinking that would be later applied abroad. The Mexican-American War created a template for Imperial War: executive manipulation, manufactured crises, congressional acquiescence, and critics silenced. It's the template that would be used again and again. The Grover Cleveland showed that principled resistance to empire remained possible. Even as late as the 1890s, the choice for empire was not inevitable. It was chosen. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 2 of Empire of Liberty, Americans' Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars, on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com. There you'll find all kinds of written articles, as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause and the New Leviathan. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes, and follow me on X at jkellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.